So what is Afrofuturism? Thank you for attending our talk. George and I are going to be tackling this awesome topic. And we have Missy dancing here. I hope you all have seen that music video. It's amazing. How Black people envision a better future through the culture. So let's kick it off. So let's start with a quote from Ingrid LaFleur. She's an art curator and Afrofuturist. Afrofuturism is an intersection of imagination, technology, the future, and liberation. And it's generally defined as a way of imagining possible futures through a Black cultural lens. And when you think about Black histories around the world, there's a legacy of colonialism and oppression that still affects Black communities today. But looking at everything that Black people have accomplished as scientists, inventors, artists, writers, activists, politicians, and as we saw last week, designers, ultimately as definers of international culture, when you look at our collective contributions to humanity, it's almost absurd to imagine a future without Black people dictating the narrative in a big way. And so with that, to that end, you go to the next slide. This quote from journalist Taylor Hoskins is relevant. Afrofuturism is a resolve to never become extinct. It's a vehicle for turning inward and reconnecting with a long history of survival to project a future that would be the ultimate survival. And from a personal perspective, I've always been a science fiction nerd. I grew up reading Ender's Game and the Dune series. My favorite book series of all time is The Three-Body Problem, and we tried to do a book club about that a while back. It didn't go as well. Not everybody is as nerdy for sci-fi as I am. I'm obsessed with Battlestar Galactica and The Expanse, and I literally had a Parliament Funkadelic cover band when I was 15. As a Black and Indigenous man, imagining all the incredible possibilities for the future would be hella depressing if I actually believed the narratives of many white science fiction authors conceiving futures of like fourth dimensional aliens and cyborgs and like every mythical creature from Harry Potter, but Black people don't exist somehow. So you kind of have to call bullshit and start imagining your own futures. And those futures might not always be ideal, especially in science fiction where dystopias and cyberpunk are common themes. But we're there dictating those futures, and that's affirming. And so let's look at some of the literature around Afrofuturism. Here you go to the next slide. So taking a first look here at Afrofuturism's contributions to literature, we have the queen of Black futurist narratives, the late, great Octavia Butler, one of my all-time favorite authors. She wrote Kindred and Parable of the Sower. She's been highly influential in sci-fi, but also with other authors. She even actually inspired the movie The Matrix. Her early work sort of led to the creation of that movie, which is super dope. I think everybody likes The Matrix. And we can go to the next slide. Other authors are N.K. Jemisin, and she's created an amazing series, the Broken Earth series, which has won every top science fiction award. And each year she released a book. She won the top science fiction award, the Hugo Award. She's won it 3 times in a row, more than any other science fiction author. She's amazing. The series is gorgeous. It's awesome. It's kind of depressing. It's this dystopian future. They're like, people have powers to like move the earth, and it's crazy. You should check it out. And she's even addressed being an African-American fantasy and sci-fi author in her short story book, How Long Till Black Future Month. That's one of my all-time favorites. It's a collection of short stories, one of which I think, George, you said she actually turned into a full-length book, and I got to check that out. So please look at her work. And then the next author we'll talk about, Micaiah Johnson, and her book, The Space Between Worlds, is about parallel universes, and it was a New York Times and NPR book review pick from last year. And I haven't read this, but George read it, and to quote him from earlier today, he's like, "It's freaking dope." And he didn't say frickin', so you know it's really good. And why does Afrofuturist literature have, why is it particularly important for us as designers and researchers? It's our job to imagine new possibilities and futures for the people we're designing for. And reading fiction helps us become more empathetic and broaden our world views. So what better way of doing that than reading Afrofuturist authors? So check them out. If you need more examples or a ton of authors we didn't talk about today, feel free to reach out to me and George. Happy to discuss it. And now I'm going to pass it off to George, talk about Afrofuturist music.
Very dope, very dope. No, I didn't know you loved the Three Body Problem so much. That's like my favorite. Those series are amazing. I would have joined.
It's so good, right? Okay, we got to talk about that later.
It's just gonna be like a nerd like going on here. So yeah, let's get into music. And I think there's probably two main artists that could start off with like Afrofuturist music. I'll get to the other one later. But I'll start off with P-Funk, which I think is amazing. Renee reminded me to put this in here, but Parliament's such an interesting group. I saw them a number of times when I was growing up, and it was such an event. It was like all of Philadelphia was like there for Parliament and like lighting up. It was like 3 or 4 hour event. Like you could hear it across the city, and like you could that was like the 2000s, and they started off in the 60s. Prior to that, I'd say George Clinton actually started off as a doo-wop group with the Parliaments. Like the Parliaments was a doo-wop group that existed like in New Jersey. In the 60s, he reformed this as this like wild funkadelic, it's like space oriented thing. And what I found, especially when kind of reviewing some of the sort of artists that I was really influenced around here, is a lot of this was happening at like a time of transition in music and sort of technology in the United States. So you have the sort of end of like the sort of traditional jazz area, or like doo-wop or jazz, and people getting into free jazz and getting into this new style of music. And then the space race is actually happening at the same time as the Soviet Union. So you see a lot of the influence in terms of what's going on of people trying new styles of music, trying new things. The 60s is obviously going on, but Black people wanted to make sure that, like Noah was saying, we exist in that future. And how do we position ourselves to show we were going to exist in the future and sort of think in a forward way? So I think, George Clinton had this sort of, awesome aesthetic, but he also had things like the Mothership, and he had a whole album around like the Mothership and coming out of space. He was a very admitted Star Trek fan and really wanted to see Black people in this future and sort of was envisioning this, sort of pushing that on the culture. I think what's interesting is that, this may seem like very, showy, but what he actually did was very influential to music and sort of shaping what that actually became. So, what's something I think is really interesting, I could go on for hours about this, is like the idea of like, Detroit electronic music and techno and house and Chicago and all of that. A lot of that was influenced by funk and electro, which was really from George Clinton, which is interesting. So, his like envisioning a new future and pushing that forward through his sort of aesthetics and sort of style of music really led to like new technological ways of using music and creating things like the first like techno track. So we have it in the playlist. It's actually called Clear by Cybertron. It's actually Juan Atkins and another guy. I think it came out in 1983. And it's amazing. If you listen to it, like that actually was the underpinnings. It came from electro and funk and is the underpinnings of like techno and like house music, even hip hop used like, Clear as like a wild like track that's used across things. So I think it's really interesting is when you put yourself out there, you can envision something, you can actually create a change in the culture for music and to pass that. So definitely worth checking that out. I think what's interesting is you kind of, take this to its like end step. This has continued to happen. So I mean, like I'm not like huge fan of Lil Nas X, but I mean, this video is really interesting if you guys want to check it out. Panini, and it's interesting to see like this style of sort of, really envisioning a future that Black people exist, even though this one's like wildly more commercial and like hilarious. Like it's great to see like a real throughput from like, George Clinton through here. I think it's worth checking this out, sort of really acknowledging how people are sort of pushing the boundaries here. Also stepping from music into film and television, Sun Ra, I think, I could really verse as like who was the first Afrofuturist sort of like Black musician. But I think what's interesting about Sun Ra is that he really pushed it. Sun Ra, I grew up in Philadelphia, again, talking about Philly. And Sun Ra, I always heard from my friends that I grew up in Northwest Philadelphia, this area of the city called Germantown. And his orchestra had like a house there. And they were like renowned in Philly for like these like crazy Black people who live in this like big communal house and make this like wild music. But what's interesting is I'm doing a little research for this last night, Sun Ra, he actually, after 68, went to the Bay Area. And a lot of this like Afrofuturist like work was really influenced by living in Oakland and actually working at Cal. He actually gave a class called The Black Man in the Cosmos in the, I think the late 60s, early 70s or something like that. He met a collaborator there and a producer and created this, what can probably only be the first and only Blaxploitation / sci-fi film called Space is the Place, which I actually had seen parts of, but watched all of yesterday. So I can attest to its madness. But what's interesting about the film, again, similar to George Clinton, and George Clinton was a little influenced by Sun Ra. Sun Ra came a little beforehand. he was obviously very into like this Egyptian sort of like Black African culture, but also seeing how we could create sort of like the Back to Africa music, like a separate space, but in a separate place, but in space. Again, like very influenced by like this, you know, the NASA and things they were doing. This film is wild. It's really interesting just in terms of themes he sort of addresses. I mean, he's obviously getting this like very strange and interesting way of like how music can transport you and move you to like into this other world and how this is very influential. But I think it's really cool because Sun Ra obviously influenced George Clinton, influenced, you know, a bunch of people who really took this music forward. So definitely worth watching and kind of crazy. You can watch it free for YouTube on YouTube. I watched it last night. You know, more modern sort of ways of like rethinking how Black women and, you know, people sort of exist within science fiction is Watchmen. Watchmen, obviously, we all may know, or I know, is very classic, you know, 80s series. And it was redone last year on HBO with a very interesting take, basically how, I mean, the original Watchmen series had no Black people in it for the most part, but basically how do you sort of take the themes of the Watchmen and relate it to Black culture? It's an amazing, amazing series, definitely worth watching. And I mean, if you're a fan of the comic, it's definitely a must watch. Lovecraft Country, another amazing show that just came out last year. This actress, Ajun Ellis, had an episode called I Am, which is one of the most beautiful episodes of television. I'm pretty positive it's gonna win like that series. It's really envisioning like Black women within, you know, this like is envisioning Black women in like a multitude of like universes and ways, and how somebody who felt very demeaned where they are sort of can sort of push past that and like find themselves by seeing themselves in multi-universes. It actually relates a lot to the Micaiah Johnson work. It relates a lot to Sun Ra and sort of, you know, if you take Black people out of Earth and put them somewhere else, what could they be? It's very amazing. The show is very amazing. It's actually Lovecraft, H.P. Lovecraft was kind of like a notorious sort of like racist, but very like seminal science fiction writer. And it's actually, again, similar to Watchmen. How do you put Black people in these spaces and sort of transform what that means for the future and for that, you know, time period? So definitely worth watching. So yeah, I mean, why does this all matter? Black Panther added this at the end, like the sort of like seminal, you know, at least a recent like, you know, Afrofuturist vision, you know, very popular. I think it was their set director Hannah Bleachers. I think this all matters, again, similar to what Noah was saying, is that, you know, we're all technologists, we're all futurists. I think Stephanie did a great job sort of expressing that in her class a number of weeks ago. And I think as you see, like the theme across this literature is like, we want Black people to survive, Black people want to survive. And, you know, they're envisioning a future where they might have something better or more to offer or seen in like better standing. But I don't think the point is that we're doing it all on our own. So, you know, I think we're showing you this work and sort of, you know, we're very effusive and expressive about this because we're, you know, both nerds and really love this stuff. But generally, I think it's worth sort of consuming this literature and understanding this music and this film and television, because it shows you, you know, other possibilities of non-white spaces, you know, Black spaces that are able to, you know, bring us all forward together in a really interesting way. So thank you for listening. And yeah, it's been dope. Check out the playlist. You know, I ordered it last night. It's all in the very specific.
Yeah, we want our outro music.